David Miller cut the engine, and a sudden silence rushed in, thick and heavy. Before him and Rex, his only companion, stood not a house, but a skeleton, left behind by time. The decaying wooden walls seemed ready to collapse. Vines clung to them like skeletal arms, and the wild garden whispered long-forgotten stories. He had gambled everything he had on this place, hoping for a new beginning. But he had no idea he hadn't just purchased a farm. He had purchased a tomb, and the deadly secret buried within was about to rise up and pull both him and Rex into the darkness. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? The ghost of who David Miller used to be haunted the stale air of his small, third-floor apartment, 50 years old. But the lines etched around his eyes and bracketing his mouth were carved by more than time. They were maps of sleepless nights and desert suns, of memories that clung to him like sand in his clothes. David was a man built on a sturdy frame, tall and once broad-shouldered, but now a subtle stoop suggested a weight far heavier than flesh and bone. His brown hair, cut short in the unshakable habit of a military man, was surrendering to a distinguished silver at the temples. It was a face that could have been handsome, rugged even, but was now mostly just tired. He had once been Lieutenant Commander Miller of the U.S. Navy, a man his wife adored and his 2 children looked up to with wide, admiring eyes. He had been the pride of his family. Now he was just David, a name that felt hollowed out and foreign on his own tongue. The uniform was packed away in a footlocker he never opened. The wife and children were ghosts too, living in cheerful, sunlit photographs on a dusty mantelpiece he tried not to look at. They had left, not out of malice, but out of a weary self-preservation. The man who came back from the war was not the husband and father who had left. The battlefield had followed him home, setting up a permanent outpost in his mind, and its chosen weapon was the amber liquid in the bottle that was never far from his hand. A low whine broke the oppressive silence. David looked down from the grimy window, overlooking a rain-slicked Portland street. A large, wet nose nudged his idle hand. Rex, his only constant, his shadow, his anchor. A 5-year-old German shepherd of striking appearance, his thick coat was a handsome mix of silver, gray, and white, more wolf than dog. His ears were perpetually alert, his dark, intelligent eyes missing nothing. Rex possessed the quiet dignity and unwavering loyalty of his breed, a calm, steady presence in the storm of David's life. He moved with a silent grace, his temperament a perfect counterbalance to David's own jagged edges. Right now, those eyes held a look of gentle concern. "I'm all right, boy," David rasped, his voice rough from disuse. He scratched behind Rex's ears, the simple, repetitive motion, a small comfort. Rex leaned into the touch, a silent reassurance that he was not going anywhere. The truth was, David was not all right. The day had started badly and was spiraling downward. A car backfiring on the street below had sent him diving for cover behind the sofa, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of cordite and dust filling his senses. The memory faded, but the tremor in his hands remained. His first instinct, the one he had trained himself to obey, was to reach for the whiskey bottle on the coffee table. That night, the ghosts were particularly loud. He drank to silence them, pouring glass after glass until the room blurred and the sharp edges of his pain grew dull. He didn't remember falling. He awoke to the rough, insistent lick of Rex's tongue on his cheek and a low, distressed whine. The sun was a cruel sliver of light cutting through the blinds. David was on the floor, his head throbbing with a vicious rhythm. The empty whiskey bottle lay on its side a few feet away, a fallen soldier. He pushed himself up, his body aching in protest, and caught his reflection in the dark screen of the television. He saw a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with a slack jaw and a pallor that spoke of deep soul sickness. Rex whined again, nudging his hand, his eyes filled with an unbearable, knowing sadness. In that moment, looking at the reflection of the man he had become, and seeing the unconditional love and worry in his dog's eyes, something inside David snapped. It was not a loud crack, but a quiet, profound shifting. He could continue this slow, pathetic descent and die alone on this floor, with only his dog to mourn him. Or he could change. The thought was terrifying. Change required an energy he wasn't sure he still possessed. But the alternative, the image of his own lonely death, was even more frightening. He stumbled to his feet and walked past the whiskey bottle, heading for the shower. For the first time in a long time, he was choosing something other than oblivion. The decision, once made, set off a cascade of others. This city was killing him. Every siren, every shout, every crowded street was a trigger. He needed silence. He needed space. He needed to get out. His savings were almost gone, bled dry by rent and alcohol. He owned his old pickup truck and the few pieces of furniture in the apartment. It wasn't much. He sold the truck first, the last tangible piece of his former life. The cash felt heavy and inadequate in his pocket. It wouldn't be enough for a new life, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough for a new start. That night, instead of opening a bottle, he opened his laptop. He scrolled past rental listings he couldn't afford. He wasn't looking for another apartment, another box to slowly die in. He was looking for a lifeline. On a whim, he typed Rural Property Auction Oregon into the search bar. He found a county website for tax-delinquent properties. Most were small parcels of land or homes that started far beyond his reach, but then he saw it. A listing with a single, grainy photo. An old farmhouse, its paint peeling, surrounded by overgrown land. The description was brutally honest. Significant structural issues, no utilities connected, sold as is. But the starting bid was only a few $100s. It was located in a remote part of the state, miles from any real town. It was perfect. With a trembling hand, David registered for the online auction. He sat there, Rex's heavy head resting on his knee, and watched the countdown timer. This was it, his final gamble. When the bidding started, he placed his bid, a number that represented nearly every dollar he had to his name. For a heart-stopping minute, another bidder competed with him, but they soon dropped out. A message flashed on the screen. Sold. He had just bought a broken-down farmhouse he had never seen, in a place he had never been. A wave of nausea and fear washed over him. What had he done? He looked down at Rex, who looked back up at him, tail giving a slow, confident thump against the floor. For the first time in a decade, David Miller didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt less like a threat and more like a possibility. The drive out of Portland was a slow exhale David hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. With each passing mile, the dense cityscape of concrete and steel gave way to towering Douglas firs and a sky that seemed to open up, vast and gray. Rex sat in the passenger seat of the newly purchased, rust-pocked utility van, his nose pressed against the window, occasionally letting out a soft woof at a passing deer. The van was packed with the meager sum of David's worldly possessions: a footlocker, a duffel bag of clothes, a few tools, and a large bag of dog food. David followed the directions from a printed map, turning off the main highway onto smaller, winding roads. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. A fine mist, so common in this part of Oregon, began to fall, clinging to the windshield and blurring the edges of the world into a soft watercolor painting. After another 20 minutes, he found the turnoff the map indicated. It was less a road and more a suggestion, a gap in the trees nearly swallowed by ferns and blackberry bushes. He eased the van through the opening, the branches scraping against the metal sides like skeletal fingers. The driveway was a long, rutted track of dirt and gravel. As he rounded a final bend, the house came into view. David's heart sank. The photograph online had been charitable. In reality, the house was a wreck, a testament to decades of neglect. It was a two-story farmhouse that had once been painted white, but now the paint was a leprous patchwork of peeling flakes, revealing the weathered, silver-gray wood beneath. The front porch sagged at a dangerous angle, its railings splintered and broken. Several windows were shattered, their empty frames like vacant eyes, while others were boarded up haphazardly. The yard was a wild, untamed jungle of knee-high grass, thorny bushes, and determined weeds that crept up the sides of the house as if trying to pull it back into the earth. "What have I done, Rex?" David murmured, shutting off the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle patter of mist on the roof. Rex, however, did not share his dismay. The moment David opened the door, the German shepherd leaped out, his tail held high. He began exploring immediately, his nose to the ground, taking in the symphony of new smells with undisguised delight. He bounded through the tall grass, a flash of gray and white against the wild green. Watching him, a small corner of David's tension eased. He got out of the van, his worn work boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. He walked slowly toward the house, his gaze taking in the full scope of the decay. It was overwhelming. The task of making this place habitable seemed impossible, a fool's errand. And yet, as he stood there, a strange feeling began to settle over him. It was quiet. A deep, profound quiet he hadn't experienced in years. There were no sirens, no shouting from neighboring apartments, no rumble of traffic. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the tall pines that ringed the property. For the first time, the noise inside his head seemed to recede, pushed back by the immense, peaceful silence of the place. Despite the ruin before him, he felt a flicker of something he had long thought dead: tranquility. He was so lost in the moment that he didn't hear the approaching vehicle until it was nearly upon them. An old, faded blue pickup truck, coughing and sputtering, rumbled up the driveway and parked next to his van. The driver's side door creaked open, and a small, wiry woman who looked to be in her late 70s emerged. She wore sturdy boots, denim jeans, and a thick flannel jacket. Her white hair was tied back in a practical bun, and her face was a roadmap of wrinkles that deepened when she smiled, which she did now. Her eyes were a bright, curious blue. Rex trotted over, not with aggression, but with polite curiosity. He sniffed her offered hand and, seemingly satisfied, allowed her to scratch his head. "Well now, he's a handsome one," the woman said, her voice clear and strong. "I saw the van turn in. Haven't seen anyone come up this driveway in years. Figured I should say hello. I'm Clara Mae Thompson. I live just down the road a ways." "David Miller," David replied, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "This is Rex." He set. Clara's gaze shifted from David to the dilapidated house, a knowing look in her eyes. She held up a basket she was carrying, a clean dish towel covering its contents. "Brought you a little something, a welcome to the neighborhood, and I figured you wouldn't have a working kitchen in there for a while." "That's very kind of you," David said, genuinely surprised by the gesture. "Thank you." "No trouble," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "So, you're the one who bought the old Vance place." We all wondered who would be brave enough, or maybe foolish enough, to take it on. "Vance place?" David asked as he accepted the heavy, warm basket. The smell of baked bread and savory herbs wafted up. "That's right. Belonged to Dr. Eleanor Vance," Clara explained, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. "Brilliant woman. A botanist, you know. Knew more about the plants in this forest than anyone. She bought this place back in the 80s, fixed it up real nice. Had the most amazing gardens." Clara gestured toward the overgrown wilderness of the yard. "You wouldn't know it to look at it now." "What happened to her?" David asked, his curiosity piqued. Clara's smile faded completely. She lowered her voice, as if sharing a secret. "She disappeared. About 30 years ago now. Just vanished into thin air one day. Her car was still here. All her research, her clothes, everything. The police came, looked around for a bit, but never found a trace of her. It was the strangest thing." She leaned a little closer. "Folks around here have their stories. Some say she just packed up and left, started a new life. But I never believed that. She loved this land too much. Others, she paused, her blue eyes locking with his, others say her spirit never left. They say on quiet nights you can still see a light moving in the upstairs windows. David, a man who had faced horrors far more tangible than ghosts, simply nodded. He was too tired to entertain local legends. But the story of the brilliant doctor who vanished lingered in his mind. "Well," Clara said, straightening up as if shaking off the somber memory, "I'll let you get settled. If you need anything, a hand with something or just a cup of coffee. My place is the one with the red mailbox about a mile back. Don't be a stranger." With a final pat for Rex, she climbed back into her noisy truck and rumbled away, leaving David and his dog alone once more. The mist had thickened into a steady drizzle. David looked from the warm basket in his hands to the dark, silent windows of his new home. It wasn't just an abandoned house anymore. It was a house with echoes, a place holding a 30-year-old mystery. The first morning at the farm dawned cold and damp. A thick fog blanketed the valley, muffling the world in a shroud of gray and reducing the surrounding forest to a series of faint, ghostly silhouettes. For David, it was the first morning in years that he had woken up without a pounding headache and the bitter taste of regret in his mouth. He had slept in the back of the van, wrapped in a thick sleeping bag with Rex curled up at his feet, a warm, living weight that was both comforting and grounding. After a simple breakfast of coffee brewed on a camp stove and the delicious bread Clara had given him, he stood before the farmhouse, hands on his hips, surveying the challenge. It was a battleground, and his new enemy was decay. Drawing on a lifetime of naval discipline, he decided to tackle it with strategy. He would clear and secure one room at a time, creating a small island of order in the sea of chaos. He chose the room to the right of the main entryway, a space he assumed had been the study. Of all the rooms on the ground floor, this one felt the most personal, the most like the heart of the house. Sunlight, weak and filtered by the fog, struggled through the grimy window panes, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes. A massive oak desk stood against the far wall, its surface covered in a thick, gray blanket of dust. Bookshelves lined another wall, many of their contents having tumbled to the floor, their pages swollen and warped by moisture. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, damp wood, and time itself. Armed with a heavy-duty trash bag, a broom, and a crowbar for stubborn debris, David set to work. He started by clearing the fallen books, handling them with a strange reverence. They were mostly scientific texts, books on botany, chemistry, and local ecology. Rex explored the room with his nose, sniffing every corner with intense interest before finally settling on an old rug near the desk, watching his master with patient eyes. For the first hour, the only sounds were the scrape of the broom on the wooden floor and the rustle of debris filling the bag. David fell into a rhythm, the mindless physical labor a welcome distraction. Then, Rex began to act strangely. It started with a low whine. David glanced over. The dog had gotten up from the rug and was sniffing intently at a section of floorboard in the corner, just to the left of the heavy desk. His tail was low, giving a slow, uncertain wag. "What is it, boy? A mouse?" David asked, going back to his sweeping. But Rex didn't stop. The sniffing became more frantic. He began to paw at the floorboard, his claws making a soft scratching sound on the old wood. The whine grew louder, more insistent. "Hey, leave it," David commanded, his voice firm. "There's enough here to fix without you tearing up the floor." Rex paused, looked back at David with an almost pleading expression, and then returned to his task with even more determination. The pawing turned into digging, and a sharp, demanding bark echoed through the silent house. David stopped working, leaning on his broom. This was not normal behavior. Rex was a disciplined dog, not prone to random mischief. This was focus. This was purpose. He had seen that same look in Rex's eyes on training fields, a single-minded intensity that did not waver. Sighing, David walked over. All right, I'm coming. Show me what's so important." Rex backed away slightly as David knelt, running his hand over the floorboards. They seemed solid, no different from the rest. But as he pressed down on the spot Rex had indicated, he felt a faint give, a slight springiness that wasn't there in the adjacent planks. His curiosity, finally overriding his skepticism, he went to retrieve the crowbar. He wedged the flat end of the tool into the thin gap between the boards and pushed. The old wood groaned in protest. With a final sharp crack, the board splintered and lifted. Rex barked once more, a sound of triumph this time. David peered into the opening. Beneath the floor was not dirt and foundation, but a small, dark man-made cavity. And nestled inside it, protected from the damp and the dust, was a plain, rectangular tin box. His heart began to beat a little faster. He reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected, its surface cool to the touch. There was no lock, just a simple latch on the front. He sat back on his heels, the box resting on his knees, with Rex nosing at it excitedly. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling like an intruder, prying into secrets that weren't his. But this was his house now. Its history, its echoes, its secrets, they were all his. He unfastened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, protected by a layer of oilcloth, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound journal. He carefully lifted it out. The leather was soft and worn with use, and the pages were yellowed at the edges. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, elegant, and precise. "Property of Dr. Eleanor Vance," it read. He carried the journal over to the front steps of the house, where the light was better, and began to read. Rex lay at his feet, resting his head on his paws, as if his job was done. The early entries were filled with scientific passion and a deep love for the Oregon wilderness. Dr. Vance wrote about her work, her dream of isolating a specific compound from a rare, local species of fern she called the ghost fern. Her notes were detailed, filled with complex formulas and diagrams David couldn't fully comprehend, but he understood the goal. She believed this compound could halt, and perhaps even reverse, the devastating effects of a rare neurodegenerative disease. Her writing was full of hope, the words of a brilliant mind on the verge of a breakthrough that could save thousands of lives. As David turned the pages, however, the tone began to shift. The hopeful scientific entries became interspersed with notes of caution and worry. About a year before her disappearance, the entries grew more infrequent, the handwriting slightly less steady. Then he reached the final few pages. The scientific notes were gone, replaced by short, fearful sentences. "He knows about my progress. His offer is an insult to the work, an insult to nature itself. He sees only profit, not people." David's blood ran cold. He read the next entry. "He visited again today, unannounced. He is a man who is not used to being told no. He said I was being naive, that my discovery would mean nothing without his company's resources." It felt less like a statement and more like a threat. Then, the very last entry, dated just 2 days before the date Clara had said she disappeared. "I have to hide this. I have to hide everything. I fear what MT will do when he learns I will never sell. He is a man without a conscience." David stared at the 2 letters, MT. The quiet house suddenly felt different, the silence no longer peaceful, but menacing. Rex had not just found a dusty old journal, he had uncovered a secret that, 30 years ago, might have been worth killing for. The journal lay hidden in David's footlocker, but its words were a constant, unsettling presence in his mind. MT. The initials had transformed the house from a simple, overwhelming renovation project into the scene of a potential crime. The silence he had initially found so peaceful now seemed to hold its breath, pregnant with unspoken secrets. To combat the rising tide of unease, David did what he had always done when faced with an intractable problem. He threw himself into hard, physical labor. His focus for the day was the sagging front porch. It was more than an eyesore, it was a genuine hazard. A large support beam on the corner had rotted through at its base, and the entire structure groaned ominously with every gust of wind. He spent the morning clearing the debris from underneath it, trying to devise a way to prop it up safely so he could assess the damage. It was a frustrating, dangerous, and distinctly two-man job. He was wrestling with a heavy-duty car jack, trying to position it on a makeshift foundation of flat stones when an unfamiliar truck pulled into the driveway. It was a newer model than Clara's, ATA, a well-kept Ford with a rack in the back holding ladders and toolboxes. A man who looked to be in his early 60s climbed out. He was about David's height, with a solid, sturdy build that spoke of a life of physical work. He had a thick head of gray hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and calm, observant hazel eyes. He wore a clean work shirt, durable canvas pants, and steel-toed boots. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hands resting easily at his sides. Rex, who had been watching David struggle from a safe distance, let out a single, low bark. The man stopped, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "Easy there, big fella," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "I'm not here to cause trouble." He looked at David. "Saw you from the road. That beam's about to give. You keep messing with it like that, and you're going to bring the whole roof down on your head." David bristled, his ingrained self-reliance and distrust of strangers immediately kicking in. "I've got it handled," he said, his tone clipped. The man didn't seem offended. He simply walked a little closer, his expert eyes scanning the structure. "My name is Arthur Henson. I live a couple miles west of here. Retired carpenter." He pointed with his chin at the rotting wood. "That's black rot. It's eaten clear through the post, and it's probably in the joist too. You can't just jack it up. You need to brace the roof properly first, then cut out and replace the whole corner section." Arthur's assessment was calm, professional, and undeniably correct. It only made David more defensive. He felt exposed, his incompetence laid bare. "Thanks for the advice," he said, turning back to the jack, "but I don't need any help." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. David could feel the man's steady gaze on his back. "Listen," Arthur said finally, his voice losing none of its calm. "I'm not looking for work. I've got more than enough projects of my own. But I also don't want to see my new neighbor get himself killed on his first week here. I've got the tools and the lumber in my truck. Let me help you brace it. It's the neighborly thing to do." David stopped, his hand hovering over the jack handle. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to send this stranger on his way. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat. It was a weakness he had never allowed himself. He looked at the rotting beam, at the precarious angle of the porch roof, and then at his own two hands, which were not enough for this fight. He thought of Rex, who depended on him entirely. Getting crushed under his own porch wouldn't do either of them any good. Swallowing his pride was a bitter pill, but it was necessary. He let out a slow breath and turned to face Arthur, giving a short, grudging nod. "All right," he said. "What do you need me to do?" A faint, understanding smile touched Arthur's lips. "Good. Let's get to work." The next few hours were a blur of focused activity. Arthur was a master of his craft, directing David with clear, concise instructions. They built temporary supports, carefully transferring the weight of the roof off the compromised corner. There was little talk, just the companionable sounds of saws, drills, and hammers. David, used to the clear chain of command and shared purpose of the military, found himself falling into an easy rhythm with the other man. Arthur didn't pry or ask personal questions. He simply worked, his competence a quiet, reassuring presence. As they were measuring a replacement beam, Arthur paused and looked at the intricate woodwork along the edge of the roof. "She always did have an eye for detail," he murmured, almost to himself. "She?" David asked. "Dr. Vance," Arthur clarified. "I did some work for her when she first moved in. Built her bookshelves, repaired some of these windows. She was a good woman to work for. Paid fairly, and always had a cold glass of lemonade waiting. Very smart. Very dedicated to her work. He shook his head slightly. It was a real shame. What happened? Arthur's words added another dimension to the woman in the journal. She wasn't just a victim or a ghost story anymore. She was a person who had hired a local carpenter, who had an eye for detail, who served lemonade on a hot day. The mystery deepened, and for the first time, David felt a connection to her, a sense of shared tenancy across time. By late afternoon, the porch was stabilized, the rotten wood cut away, and a new, solid corner post securely in place. It wasn't finished, but it was safe. The two men stood back, covered in sawdust and sweat, looking at their handiwork. "It's a start," Arthur said with satisfaction. "I couldn't have done it without you," David admitted, the words feeling strange but right. "Thank you, Arthur." "Like I said, just being neighborly," Arthur replied, already packing his tools. "You've got a long road ahead of you with this place. Don't be too proud to ask for help." As Arthur's truck disappeared down the driveway, David remained on the porch, running his hand over the new, sturdy beam. Rex came and sat beside him, leaning his weight against David's leg. The air was growing cool as evening approached. He looked at the solid porch, at his loyal dog, and thought of the quiet, capable man who had asked for nothing in return. For the first time in a very, very long time, David Miller didn't feel completely alone. The initials M.T. were a splinter in David's mind. For 2 days, he tried to ignore them, focusing on the practical, back-breaking work of clearing the yard and patching a leak in the roof. But the name haunted the quiet moments, a ghost more real than any local legend. He was a man trained to assess threats, to gather intelligence before acting. He couldn't move forward without knowing who he was up against. The isolation of the farm, once a comfort, now felt like a liability. He needed information. He left Rex on the newly secured porch, with a fresh bowl of water and a command to stay, a command the dog obeyed with a soft whine of reluctance. David drove the van into the nearest town, a small, sleepy place called Cedar Creek. The town's public library was a modest brick building that smelled of old books and floor polish. It was quiet, peaceful, and had 2 computers with a surprisingly fast internet connection. Sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair, David felt conspicuous in his worn flannel shirt and jeans, a rough-hewn figure in a world of digital information. He started his search broadly, typing in the name of the neurodegenerative disease he'd read about in the journal. He added the years 1985 to 1990, and the words pharmaceutical research. The search yielded a torrent of scientific papers and articles. He patiently sifted through them, his eyes scanning for anything connected to the Pacific Northwest. After an hour, he found a series of financial news articles about a promising, aggressive company called Thorne Biopharma. In the late 80s, they had poured millions into developing a revolutionary treatment for the exact same disease Dr. Vance was studying. His pulse quickened. He clicked on an article profiling the company's CEO. A picture loaded onto the screen showing a man in an expensive suit, younger then, with dark, slicked-back hair and a smile that was all confidence and sharp edges. His name was Marcus Thorne, M.T. David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He kept digging. He found article after article detailing Thorne Biopharma's spectacular public failure. After bold predictions and a soaring stock price, their clinical trials had collapsed. The drug was ineffective and had dangerous side effects. The news had sent their stock plummeting, wiping out fortunes and deeply humiliating its proud CEO. The timeline was a perfect match. Thorne's public failure occurred just months before the threats began appearing in Dr. Vance's journal. It was all there. The motive was as clear as day. Marcus Thorne was a man who had failed, and it appeared he had found someone to blame, or rather, someone from whom he could steal a success. David printed a few of the key articles, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled the warm pages from the printer. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a story about greed, power, and a rich man who did not like to lose. He drove back to the farm with the name Marcus Thorne echoing in his head. The weight of the discovery was immense. He was no longer just a man fixing a house. He was the custodian of a secret that had gotten a brilliant woman killed. A secret involving a man who was now likely one of the most powerful figures in the pharmaceutical industry. Back at the farm, the afternoon sun was warm, filtering through the tall pines. He let Rex out for a run, needing a moment to clear his head. He watched the dog bound through the meadow behind the house, a picture of pure, uncomplicated joy. But then, Rex's demeanor changed abruptly. He stopped mid-stride, his head raised, his nose twitching as he tested the air. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Before David could call him back, Rex took off. He didn't run playfully, but with the focused, driving speed of a predator on a scent. He veered away from the meadow and plunged deep into the dense, old-growth forest that bordered the property. "Rex, heel!" David shouted, his voice sharp with command. The dog ignored him, disappearing into the shadows of the ancient trees, cursing under his breath. David took off after him. He ran through the thick undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, his heart pounding with a mix of annoyance and fear. He could hear Rex's frantic barking up ahead, a beacon guiding him deeper into the woods. He finally burst into a small, secluded clearing, dominated by a thick, gnarled thicket of wild ivy and blackberry bushes that had grown into an impenetrable wall of green. Rex was at the base of it, digging furiously, sending dirt and leaves flying. He was barking without pause, his entire body trembling with intensity. "What in the world have you found now?" David panted, trying to catch his breath. He grabbed Rex's collar, but the dog was single-minded, straining against his grip to get back to his digging. David looked closer at the spot. It was just a mound of earth and vines, no different from the rest of the forest floor. But Rex's certainty was infectious. Trusting the dog's instincts, which had already proven sharper than his own, David began to tear at the thick vines, his hands quickly becoming scratched and raw. He pulled away layers of tangled green, clearing away decades of overgrowth. After several minutes of hard work, his fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and unnatural. Metal. He worked faster, his adrenaline surging. He tore away the last of the covering and stared in disbelief. Hidden beneath the mound, flush with the earth, and almost perfectly camouflaged, was a heavy, rectangular steel door with a rusted iron handle. A cellar door, in the middle of the woods, far from the house. It took all of David's strength to pull it open. The hinges screamed in protest, and the door lifted with a groan, revealing a set of steep concrete steps leading down into darkness. A cool, musty but clean smell, like a wine cellar, wafted up. He took a flashlight from his pocket and aimed its beam into the depths. The light revealed a small, windowless room, but it was no cellar. It was a laboratory. Unlike the house, this place was pristine, a time capsule sealed away from the elements. Stainless steel counters lined one wall, holding beakers, microscopes, and complex scientific equipment that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. Shelves on the other wall were filled with neatly labeled jars of dried plants and glass vials of liquid. Charts and molecular diagrams were pinned to a large corkboard. And on a central workbench sat a stack of thick, meticulously organized binders. David descended the steps, Rex close at his heels. He walked over to the workbench and opened the top binder. The pages were filled with the same neat, precise handwriting from the journal. But this wasn't a journal. This was the work itself. The complete, unadulterated research, with detailed experimental data, documented results, and the final, perfected formula for the compound derived from the ghost fern. He stood there in the silent subterranean lab, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the life's work of Dr. Eleanor Vance. This was it. This was the treasure Marcus Thorne had been after. This was the secret she had died to protect, and now he was the one standing guard. Sleep did not come easily to David that night. The discovery in the hidden lab had changed everything. He had carefully carried the binders back to the house, their weight feeling less like paper and more like a sacred, dangerous trust. He sat late into the night at the dusty dining table, a single battery-powered lantern casting a pool of light, reading Dr. Vance's words by the page. The sheer brilliance of her work was staggering, a symphony of chemistry and botany that he could only partially grasp. But he understood the conclusion. She had found a cure. Before dawn, he returned to the woods and meticulously recamouflaged the cellar door, piling brush and fallen leaves over it until it was once again invisible, swallowed by the forest. A knot of paranoia had taken root in his gut. The quiet of the farm no longer felt entirely peaceful. It felt watchful. He was a soldier again, on guard duty in hostile territory. He spent the next day on the porch, one of the binders open on his lap, Rex lying faithfully at his feet. The sun was warm and the air was clean, but David couldn't relax. Every rustle of leaves in the woods, every distant bird call, made him look up, his senses on high alert. He was trying to formulate a plan, but his thoughts were a tangled mess. What was he supposed to do with this information? Go to the police? The same police who had barely investigated a woman's disappearance 30 years ago? It was mid-afternoon when he heard it, a low, unfamiliar hum that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of an expensive, well-tuned engine, completely out of place among the sputtering tractors and old pickups of the area. A moment later, a sleek black sedan, gleaming as if it had just rolled off the showroom floor, appeared at the end of the driveway. It moved slowly, its polished chrome glinting in the sun, its tires crunching cautiously on the gravel. Rex was on his feet instantly, before the car even came to a full stop. A low, deep growl rumbled in his chest, and the fur along his spine bristled. He moved to stand directly in front of David, planting his feet in a wide, defensive stance. The car door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit stepped out. He was in his 40s, with slick, dark hair, a clean-shaven jaw, and sunglasses that hid his eyes. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, a ridiculous choice for a muddy farm. He closed the door with a soft, expensive click and surveyed the dilapidated farmhouse with a faint, dismissive smile. When he saw David and the formidable German shepherd, the smile widened, becoming practiced and professional. "Mr. Miller?" he called out, his voice smooth as silk. "David Miller?" David didn't answer immediately. He placed a calming hand on Rex's back, though the dog's muscles remained coiled tight as a spring. "Who's asking?" he said, his voice flat. The man walked forward, stopping a safe distance from the porch steps. He removed his sunglasses, revealing a pair of cold, intelligent gray eyes. "My name is Sterling. I'm a senior partner with a private realty acquisitions firm. I apologize for the unannounced visit, but my client is a man who values discretion and expediency." "I'm not selling," David said bluntly. Mr. Sterling's smile didn't falter. "You haven't heard my offer. My client has a deep appreciation for large, private parcels of land like this one. He values isolation. He has authorized me to offer you $250,000 for this property, as is cash transaction. We handle all the paperwork, and it can be in your account by the end of the week." The number hung in the air, stunning David into silence. $250,000. It was more money than he had ever seen. It was enough to buy a proper house, a new truck, enough to live on for years. It was an escape hatch, a golden ticket out of the mess he had stumbled into. For a fleeting second, he was tempted. He could take the money, disappear, and let this dangerous secret remain buried. But then he looked down at Rex. The dog had not moved. His growl was constant, a low-frequency hum of pure menace. His lip was curled back slightly, revealing the tip of a long, white canine tooth. Rex saw something his own eyes did not. He saw the predator beneath the expensive suit, and David's own training kicked in. A real estate agent doesn't drive a $70,000 car to a derelict property to make a blind offer 5 times its worth. This wasn't a business deal. This was a probe. They were testing him. They were trying to buy his silence. "The answer is no," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "The farm is not for sale." For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed Mr. Sterling's smooth features. "Mr. Miller, perhaps you don't appreciate the generosity of this offer. An opportunity like this is unlikely to present itself again." "I'll take my chances," David replied, standing up slowly. Rex stood with him, a loyal, gray shadow. The message was clear. The conversation was over. Mr. Sterling stared at him for a long, calculating moment. The mask of politeness slipped away entirely. The smile vanished, and his eyes became as hard and cold as river stones. He put his sunglasses back on, a deliberate, final gesture. "A man of principle," he said, his voice now holding a faint, mocking edge. "I see." He turned and walked back to his car. With his hand on the door, he paused and looked back at David. "This property has a complicated history, Mr. Miller," he said, the silky tone now laced with ice. "My client has an interest in seeing that history remain undisturbed. Some things are better left buried in the past. It would be a shame if someone were to stir up trouble for themselves by digging where they shouldn't." The veiled threat hung in the quiet country air. He got into the car, and the engine purred to life. The black sedan turned around and glided back down the driveway, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only a faint cloud of dust and a heavy, palpable sense of dread. David stood motionless on the porch, his heart pounding a steady, familiar rhythm he recognized from his combat days. The first shot had been fired. He reached down and buried his hand in the thick fur of Rex's neck. The dog finally relaxed, leaning his weight against David's leg. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" David whispered. "You knew right from the start." The shadows were no longer just echoes from the past. They were here, now, and they had a name: Marcus Thorne. The visit from the man in the black sedan shattered David's fragile sense of peace. The farm was no longer a refuge. It was a contested territory. He was on high alert, his military training taking over. He slept in short, restless bursts, a loaded shotgun propped near the van's door. He did a perimeter check of the property every morning and evening, Rex trotting silently beside him, his senses seeming to scan the tree line just as intently as David's eyes did. David found himself trusting the dog's instincts more than ever, watching for the subtle flick of an ear or a low growl that might signal an unseen presence. The first clear attack came 3 days after Sterling's visit. It was a crisp morning, and David was in the house, attempting to rig a temporary water line from the well to the kitchen sink. He had managed to get a trickle of water flowing. To celebrate the small victory, he filled a bowl for Rex and was about to fill the percolator for his own coffee. Rex padded over to the bowl, lowered his head, and then froze. He sniffed the water, his nose barely touching the surface, and then recoiled with a disgusted snort, backing away as if the bowl contained a snake. He looked up at David and let out a single, sharp bark. "What's wrong with it?" "It's just water," David said, still pleased with his handiwork. He turned the tap on to fill the coffee pot. Rex's reaction was immediate and frantic. He began barking loudly, a series of urgent, high-pitched alarms. He pushed his head between David and the sink, physically blocking him from the stream of water. "Rex, what has gotten into you?" David said, pushing the dog gently aside. Rex refused to be moved. He barked again, this time with a note of desperation that chilled David to the bone. This was not a game. This was a serious warning. Trust the dog. The thought was immediate and absolute. David shut off the tap and looked at the bowl of water on the floor. It looked clear. It looked normal. But Rex would not go near it. His stomach clenched. He walked out the back door and headed directly for the old stone well that served as the farm's only water source. As he got closer, he noticed something was wrong. The heavy, circular wooden cover, which he knew he had seated firmly the day before, was slightly ajar, shifted just an inch. He lifted it off. An acrid, faintly oily chemical smell immediately hit him, burning his nostrils. It was not the clean, earthy scent of fresh well water. It was the smell of poison. Someone had come onto his property in the dead of night and deliberately contaminated his water supply. If it weren't for Rex, he would have been drinking it, making coffee with it. The thought sent a wave of cold fury through him. He spent the rest of the day hauling bottled water from his van, his mind racing. This was a clear escalation from a veiled threat to a direct, potentially lethal attack. They weren't just trying to scare him off anymore. A few days later, running low on supplies, he knew he had to go to town. His van was low on gas, so he gratefully accepted Arthur's offer to borrow his old, reliable pickup truck. He promised to be back before dark. As he was about to climb into the driver's seat, Rex, who had been watching him from the porch, suddenly bolted forward. He planted himself directly in front of the truck's grill, blocking the path, and began to bark. It was the same frantic, insistent alarm as before. "Not this again, Rex," David said with a weary sigh. "It's Arthur's truck. It's fine. Move." Rex did not move. He barked louder, his body rigid, his eyes locked on David's. Impor too. He was a four-legged, non-negotiable roadblock. "Rex! I mean it! Out of the way!" David shouted, his patience fraying. The dog just stood his ground, barking as if his life depended on it. David's frustration warred with the memory of the poisoned well. The dog had been right then. What if he was right now? With a growl of annoyance, David dropped to one knee. "Fine, I'll look. See? It's just a truck." He peered under the chassis. Everything looked normal at first, just the usual dirt and grime of a farm truck. But then his trained eye caught it. A dark, wet patch on the dirt directly under the driver's side front wheel, and above it, something glinted in the sunlight. It was the fresh, clean gleam of recently cut metal. He crawled further under. His blood ran cold. The hydraulic line to the front brake caliper had been severed, cut cleanly through with a pair of snips. A slow, steady drip of brake fluid was pooling on the ground. The driveway sloped steeply down to the main road. If he had started the truck and driven even 50 feet, he would have had no brakes. The implications were terrifyingly clear. This time, David knew he had no choice. He walked back into the house and called the police. An hour later, the county sheriff's car ambled up the driveway. The man who emerged was Sheriff Brody, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a drooping mustache and a weary, perpetually bored expression, as if every call was an interruption to his eventual retirement. David explained everything calmly and clearly. He showed him the contaminated well, still sealed off. He showed him the cleanly cut brake line on Arthur's truck. Sheriff Brody listened with a distinct lack of interest, poking at the brake line with the tip of a pen. "You sure this line didn't just rust through?" he asked, his voice a tired drawl. "These old trucks. Things break." "It was cut, Sheriff," David said, keeping his voice level. "You can see the tool marks. And that doesn't explain the chemicals in my well." "Right. The well," Brody said, rubbing his chin. "Probably just some local kids playing a prank, dumping something they shouldn't have. Happens sometimes." He looked around the property, his gaze dismissive. "Look, Mr. Miller, you're new here. You buy a rundown place like this. Sometimes you get a little trouble from local vandals. It's petty stuff. I'll file a report, but honestly, there's not much to go on. No suspects, no witnesses." "Ed not to." "This isn't petty vandalism," David said, his voice hardening. "This is attempted murder." The sheriff gave him a look that was a mixture of pity and annoyance. "That's a mighty strong accusation. You have any idea who would want to murder you?" David thought of Marcus Thorne, but he knew how insane it would sound. A billionaire CEO trying to kill him over this wreck of a farm? Without the binders as proof, he had nothing. He remained silent. "Right," the sheriff said, taking his silence as confirmation. "Look, I'll ask around, but my advice? Get a better lock for your gate." He climbed back into his car and drove off, leaving David standing in the driveway, a cold, hard certainty settling in his soul. The law wasn't going to help him. No one was coming. He and Rex were entirely on their own. The departure of Sheriff Brody's patrol car left a profound and chilling silence in its wake. David stood in the driveway for a long time, the sheriff's dismissive words echoing in his ears. Petty stuff. Local vandals. He felt a familiar, cold rage settle over him, the kind he hadn't felt since his days in the service. It was the rage of a man who sees a profound injustice being deliberately ignored. He was alone. The established systems of protection were not just useless, they were a barrier to the truth. He walked back into the house, Rex padding silently at his side. The equation had changed. This was no longer about defending his new home. This was about survival. This was a war, and Marcus Thorne had already tried to kill him twice. A soldier does not wait for the third attack. A soldier gathers intelligence, finds a vulnerability, and prepares to strike back. Dr. Vance's research was the motive, but it wasn't proof of a crime. The journal was just one person's word. He needed something more. He needed something undeniable, something a dismissive cop couldn't wave away as a prank. He had searched the house and the lab. There was only one place left on the property he hadn't meticulously scoured: the barn. The barn was a massive, cathedral-like structure, its timbers weathered to a deep gray. Inside, it was a cavern of shadows and dust, smelling of ancient hay, rust, and forgotten seasons. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, creating spotlights on the junk-filled interior: a derelict tractor, piles of rotting lumber, and generations of abandoned farm equipment. It was an overwhelming mess, a perfect place to hide something forever. David started his search with grim determination, working in a grid pattern, just as he'd been trained to clear a hostile building. He spent hours sifting through debris, his hands growing grimy, his muscles aching. He found nothing but rust, rot, and the nests of long-gone mice. Frustration began to set in. It was a hopeless task. Meanwhile, Rex had been conducting his own more efficient search. He wasn't looking with his eyes, but with his nose, that magnificent instrument that could read stories in the air. While David was focused on a pile of old feed sacks, Rex became intensely interested in a far corner of the barn, a place where a mountain of old, stiff tarps and broken furniture was piled high. He began to whine, a low, insistent sound. He paced back and forth in front of the junk pile, his nose twitching. David, lost in his own search, didn't notice at first. Rex, sensing his master's inattention, trotted over and nudged David's hand firmly with his wet nose before returning to the corner and letting out a sharp bark. "What is it now, boy?" David asked, wiping sweat from his brow. He followed the dog, who was now pawing at the edge of a heavy canvas tarp. "More mice? We've got bigger problems." Rex barked again, a command this time. He looked from the pile to David, his intelligent eyes insistent. Just like with the floorboards, just like with the water, this was not a game. David sighed, his frustration giving way to a familiar trust in his partner. He grabbed the edge of the tarp. It was heavy and stiff with age, but he hauled it back, revealing more junk underneath. Rex, however, kept his focus on a specific spot on the floor now that it was clear. Beneath a broken wooden chair, half hidden by shadows, was a large, dark object. David moved the chair aside and his breath caught. It was a trunk, an old sea-style footlocker bound with iron straps, covered in a thick layer of dust that looked as old as the barn itself. He dragged it out into a beam of sunlight. It wasn't locked. With a screech of rusty hinges, he heaved the heavy lid open. The interior smelled of cedar and thyme. It seemed mostly empty, except for a few moth-eaten wool blankets. Disappointment washed over him. But as he lifted one of the blankets, he saw it. Tucked into the corner was a small handheld cassette recorder, the kind journalists and investigators used in the 80s, and a single, clear plastic microcassette case. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. A small typewritten label was stuck to the cassette. It read, May 12, 1989. The recorder was dead. its batteries having dissolved into corrosive powder long ago. A frantic search of his own supplies in the van yielded 2 fresh AA batteries. With his heart pounding against his ribs, he fitted them into the recorder, inserted the cassette, and rewound it with a soft whirring sound. He took a deep breath and pressed the play button. First, there was a long, low hiss of blank tape. Then, a woman's voice, calm and resolute. It was, he knew instantly, the voice of Dr. Eleanor Vance. "For the record," she said, her voice clear despite the tape's age, "I am again refusing your offer, Mr. Thorne. My work is not for sale, not at any price." He cast on. Then, a man's voice, dripping with arrogance and impatience. A voice David recognized from news clips he had watched at the library. It was Marcus Thorne. "Doctor, don't be a fool," Thorne's voice sneered. "You're a woman playing with plants in the woods. I'm offering you a fortune, a chance to have your name in the history books. Without my company, that formula of yours will rot in this barn with the rest of your quaint little projects." "The formula belongs to the people who need it," Dr. Vance's voice replied, unwavering. "Not to your shareholders. I will not allow you to patent it and charge a fortune for something nature has provided." There was a pause, and then Thorne's voice dropped, losing its condescending tone and becoming something cold and dangerous. "You are making a very serious mistake. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have built an empire, and I did not do it by letting sentimental old women stand in my way. You will give me that research. It is not a request." "And if I refuse?" she challenged. The final words on the tape sent a shard of ice through David's veins. "Then you will have nothing," Thorne's recorded voice hissed. "And no one will ever find you to ask what happened. Everyone has a weakness, Doctor. Everyone has something to lose." The tape clicked and went silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of the empty recording. David sat frozen on the dusty floor of the barn, the small plastic recorder clutched in his hand. It felt as heavy as a loaded gun. He was no longer just holding a piece of the past. He was holding a voice from the grave. He was holding a direct, unambiguous threat from a murderer. This was the proof. This was the weapon. The weight of the cassette tape was heavier than any weapon David had ever carried. He had listened to the recording a dozen times, the chilling exchange between a principled scientist and a ruthless predator etching itself into his memory. He had the motive from the journal. He had the threat on tape, but he knew, with the cold certainty of a strategist, that it wasn't enough. Thorne was a billionaire, insulated by layers of wealth and power. After 30 years, a grainy audio recording might not be enough to secure a conviction. He felt a gnawing sense that something was still missing, a final, concrete piece of the puzzle that would make the case undeniable. Driven by this conviction, he went back to the source. He spread Dr. Vance's journal open on the kitchen table, the research binders stacked beside it. He read through it again, page by page, this time not for motive, but for a message he might have missed. He was looking for a final breadcrumb, a last will and testament disguised as a scientific note. He found it on the very last page, tucked below the final, fearful entry about MT. It was a single, cryptic sentence that he had previously dismissed as a stray thought. "Should my work fall silent, my final insurance rests where the old man watches the sun set, protected by his deepest roots." David read the line over and over. It was a riddle. My work falls silent. A euphemism for her death. Insurance. More evidence. The key was the location, where the old man watches the sunset. He stood up and walked out onto the porch, Rex following close behind. His eyes scanned the property line. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow descent in the west, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of orange and pink. His gaze fell upon a single, magnificent tree that stood alone on a small ridge at the westernmost edge of his property. It was an ancient oak, a true giant, its massive trunk gnarled and thick, its sprawling branches reaching toward the sky like weary arms. It was far older than the house, older than the town. It was the undisputed old man of this land, and from its vantage point on the ridge, it had a perfect, unobstructed view of the setting sun. "Come on, boy," David said, his voice tight with anticipation. He grabbed a shovel from the barn, his heart hammering in his chest. As they walked across the overgrown field toward the ridge, Rex seemed to sense the shift in his master's demeanor. The dog trotted ahead, his tail held high, his nose to the ground. As they neared the ancient oak, Rex's behavior changed. He broke into a run, making a beeline for the base of the massive tree. He stopped right at the point where the trunk met the earth, amidst a tangle of thick, exposed roots, and began to dig with a frantic, focused energy, just as he had in the woods. He had found it. The intellectual puzzle and the dog's primal instinct had led them to the exact same spot. "All right, I've got it from here," David said, placing a hand on Rex's back. He plunged the shovel into the soft, dark earth next to a thick root. The digging was hard. The ground was a dense web of smaller roots, and he had to work carefully. But he was driven by a certainty that he was in the right place. After 15 minutes of strenuous work, about 2 feet down, the tip of his shovel struck something hard with a dull, plastic thud, not the sharp clink of a rock. He dropped to his knees and dug with his bare hands, his fingers clawing at the soil. He uncovered the corner of a hard, black case. It looked like a modern, heavy-duty, waterproof and crush-proof container, the kind used for sensitive camera equipment. Dr. Vance had clearly planned for the long-term preservation of whatever was inside. He finally worked it free of the earth and roots and lifted it out. It was heavy, sealed tight, with 2 strong latches. He carried it back to the porch, set it on the steps, and took a deep, steadying breath. With Rex watching him intently, he unfastened the latches and opened the lid. There was no hiss of air. The seal had held perfectly. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were 3 items. The first was a thick, sealed envelope. David carefully opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a letter, written in Dr. Vance's elegant script. "To whomever finds this," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the man responsible is Marcus Thorne. He will stop at nothing to possess my research. The enclosed items are my final insurance policy. The photographs prove he was here, threatening me. The map is the most important piece. It leads to the final truth, the one piece of evidence he cannot erase. I implore you, do not take this to the local authorities. Thorne's influence is far-reaching. Take this directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Let the truth be known. Let justice be done. Eleanor Vance." David's hands were shaking as he put the letter down. He picked up the second item, a stack of photographs. They were grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, likely from an upstairs window of the house. But they were unmistakable. There was Marcus Thorne, younger but still recognizable, standing on this very porch. His face was contorted in a mask of rage as he argued with a tall, dignified woman who could only be Dr. Vance. The photos were irrefutable proof that Thorne had been to the farm. The final item was a hand-drawn map on a piece of waterproof vellum. It was a detailed topographical map of a section of the nearby national forest, about 30 miles away. A single spot was marked with a precise red X. Below the map were a set of handwritten latitude and longitude coordinates. David, the former naval officer, stared at the coordinates. He knew exactly what they represented. Not a general area, but a precise location, accurate to within a few feet. He knew with a crushing, somber certainty what the map led to. It wasn't more research. It was a grave. The final truth. Dr. Vance's body. He gathered everything. The journal, the binders, the cassette tape, and the contents of the waterproof box. He had it all. The motive, the threat, the opportunity, and now, the location of the body. Her final letter was his instruction manual. Do not trust the local police. Go to the FBI. He walked into the house, leaving the empty hole beneath the ancient oak. He sat down at the table, the evidence spread out before him, like a battle plan. He picked up his cell phone, its signal weak but present. He dialed, and when the operator answered, his voice was steady, clear, and full of grim purpose. "Yes," he said. "I need to be connected to the nearest field office of the FBI." The call to the FBI set in motion a chain of events that moved with a speed and force that left David breathless. Less than 12 hours later, two black SUVs, unmarked but official, rolled up his driveway. A man and a woman in professional, sober suits stepped out. They were Special Agent Riley and Special Agent Chen. Unlike Sheriff Brody, their eyes were sharp, their questions precise, and their demeanor serious. They listened to David's entire story without interruption, their expressions unreadable but intent. David laid out all the evidence on the kitchen table: the journal, the audio cassette, the photographs, the final letter, and the map. He watched as they examined each piece, their professional calm a stark contrast to the violent, emotional story the items told. They treated him not as a crank, but as a crucial witness. For the first time, David felt the immense weight on his shoulders begin to shift. They took the evidence, carefully bagging and tagging each item. A forensics team was dispatched to the National Forest, following the coordinates on Dr. Vance's map. 2 days later, Agent Riley called. "We found her, Mr. Miller," the agent said, his voice quiet and respectful. "The remains have been positively identified as Dr. Eleanor Vance." The coroner confirmed the cause of death was not natural. "You were right about everything." The news hit David with a profound, somber finality. The ghost of the Vance place now had a name, a story, and a final resting place. The last piece of the puzzle was in place. With the discovery of the body and the mountain of evidence David had provided, the story exploded onto the national stage. News vans clogged the narrow country road leading to the farm. Headlines across the country told the sensational tale: Pharma CEO implicated in 30-year-old murder. Justice for the ghost botanist. A veteran's lonely quest for truth. Facing irrefutable evidence, including the testimony of a former security chief who finally broke his silence, Marcus Thorne was arrested. His corporate empire, built on a foundation of lies and murder, crumbled into dust. Thorne Biopharma collapsed under the weight of the scandal and federal investigations. Marcus Thorne, the powerful man who believed he was above consequences, was convicted and would spend the rest of his life in prison. Justice, after 30 long years, had finally been served. 1 year later, the farm was almost unrecognizable. The house, once a decaying wreck, was now beautifully restored, its fresh white paint gleaming in the Oregon sun. The sagging porch was strong and welcoming, with 2 rocking chairs overlooking a yard that was no longer a wild jungle. In its place were lovingly tended gardens, painstakingly recreated from the diagrams in Dr. Vance's journal. The air, once thick with decay, now carried the scent of lavender, mint, and blooming roses. The land was alive again. The transformation was not David's work alone. After the story broke, the community had rallied around him. Arthur had organized a team of volunteer carpenters and builders. Clara had brought an army of gardeners from the local horticultural society. They had all come together to help resurrect the Vance place, turning a site of tragedy into a symbol of resilience. David sat in one of the rocking chairs, a mug of black coffee in his hands. He looked different, too. The haunted, tired look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm clarity. The tremor in his hands had long since vanished. He was sober. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were faint, like echoes from a distant shore, no longer the all-consuming tidal waves they once were. He had won a significant sum in a civil suit against Thorne's estate. He used that money not for himself, but to establish the Eleanor Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding young, independent botanical researchers and ensuring Dr. Vance's formula for the neurodegenerative disease would be developed and distributed affordably, honoring her final wish. The farm was now the foundation's headquarters, a place of healing and research. He finally had a new mission. A loud, happy bark pulled him from his thoughts. Rex, his coat shining and his eyes bright, trotted up the porch steps, carrying a well-loved tennis ball, and dropped it at David's feet. David smiled, bending down to scratch the dog's head. "Not right now, boy," he said softly. "I've got a call to make." He pulled out his phone and dialed. It was a call that a year ago he would have thought impossible. A young woman's voice answered on the second ring. "Hi, Dad. Hode?" "Hey, Sarah," David said, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "How are you?" His daughter, who had seen her father's story on the news, had been the first to call. Then his son. The conversations had been hesitant at first, fragile bridges being built over a chasm of pain and misunderstanding. But they were building. She was planning to visit with her brother in the fall. For the first time in a decade, he was a father again. "I'm good," she said. "Just wanted to see how you were doing. Is it peaceful out there today?" David looked out at the green fields, at the dark, silent forest beyond. He looked at the loyal dog sitting at his feet, the friend who had led him out of the darkness, one discovery at a time. He thought of the quiet, brilliant woman who had entrusted him with her legacy. This land, once a symbol of loneliness and loss, was now his sanctuary. "Yeah, sweetheart," David said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It's real peaceful." He ended the call and looked at Rex, who nudged his hand with the tennis ball again, his tail wagging with endless optimism. David laughed, a real, easy laugh, and took the ball. He stood up, feeling the solid wood of the porch beneath his feet. He had come here looking for an escape, a place to hide from the world and himself. He had found something else entirely, a purpose, a community, a family. On a plot of land once defined by a tragic ending, David Miller, with his faithful dog by his side, had finally found his beginning. He had found a home. The bond between a person and their loyal companion is a powerful testament to healing, a quiet reminder that no one is beyond the reach of redemption. David's journey teaches us that sometimes, when you set out to rescue an animal, you are truly rescuing yourself. If this story of courage and second chances touched your heart, you can help us share more of them with a simple like and by sharing it with a friend who might need a message of hope. We would love for you to join our community by subscribing, and we invite you to share your own stories in the comments below. Your next journey with us is ready to begin right now in the video that has just appeared on your screen.